What would you do if you saw a broken man, forgotten by the world, begging for scraps on a cold, empty street? What if behind his weary eyes and tattered clothes there was a story of sacrifice that could shatter your heart? What if a single moment, a fleeting glance, could change everything for him and for someone who thought they'd buried the past? Under the grey November sky of a small town in upstate New York, where the air bites with the sharp edge of winter and the streets are lined with diners and dollar stores, a mystery unfolds on a corner that most folks just pass by. A man, hidden beneath layers of filth and despair, holds out a trembling hand for something, anything, to fill the gnawing emptiness inside him. But what he doesn't know is that today a pair of eyes will see past the grime, past the years, and straight into a memory that refuses to stay buried. His name is John Carver, though most folks around here don't bother to ask. He's just another shadow on the sidewalk, a piece of the scenery you learn to ignore while rushing to work or grabbing a coffee at the local diner. John's face is weathered, carved by time and pain, with a scruffy beard that hides the scars on his jawline, scars that don't come from a razor but from shrapnel that once tore through flesh and bone. His eyes, a faded blue, carry the weight of countless sleepless nights, haunted by echoes of gunfire and screams that never quite leave him, even in the quiet of an American small-town morning. He wears an old army jacket, the olive drab fabric frayed at the cuffs, the name tape on the chest barely readable, a relic of a life he once lived with purpose. The jacket hangs loose on his gaunt frame, and pinned to it is a small, tarnished medal, a Purple Heart dulled by years of dirt and neglect, a silent testament to a war he survived but never truly escaped. John sits on a piece of cardboard near the entrance of Betty's Diner, a cozy little spot on Main Street where the smell of fresh apple pie and sizzling bacon wafts out every time the door swings open. The diner's neon sign flickers above, casting a faint red glow on the cracked pavement where he's parked himself. It's the kind of place where locals gather for gossip over a stack of pancakes, where waitresses call you Hon, and the jukebox plays Johnny Cash and Patsy Cline on a loop. Thanksgiving decorations, paper turkeys and cornucopias adorn the windows, a reminder of a holiday John hasn't celebrated in years, not since the world turned its back on him after he came home from Iraq. His hands clutch a tin cup, the metal dented and cold, as he mutters a quiet please to passers-by who barely glance his way. The wind cuts through his thin jacket, but the real chill lives deeper, in the hollow of his chest, where memories of sand and blood and brothers lost play on repeat. Every morning, John wakes to the same grind, the same fight to keep going when there's no reason left to. He shuffles through the town, scavenging for coins in parking lots, digging through trash bins behind the diner when no one's looking, hoping for a half-eaten sandwich or a leftover slice of pie that hasn't gone stale. Sometimes, he'll sit by the old war memorial near the town square, a granite slab etched with names of the fallen, and he'll trace his fingers over the letters, wondering why his name isn't there, why he got to come back when so many didn't. His body aches from sleeping on concrete, his knees creak with every step, and the tremors in his hands aren't just from the cold, they're from the ghosts that claw at him in the dead of night, from the nightmares of roadside bombs and the faces of men he couldn't save. He's tried to piece himself back together, applied for odd jobs at hardware stores or gas stations, but the stares, the whispers, the sorry we're not hiring always push him back to the streets. And beneath it all, there's a quiet ache, a longing for something or someone he lost long ago, a name he doesn't dare speak aloud, a memory tied to the ink on his forearm, hidden under the sleeve of his jacket, a tattoo of a date and a pair of initials that burn every time he catches a glimpse of it. Today, though, feels heavier than most. The air is thick with the promise of snow, and the streets are quieter, folks bundled up and hurrying to get out of the cold. John's got nothing in his cup but a few pennies, not even enough for a cup of gas station coffee to warm his bones. His stomach twists with hunger, a sharp, relentless pang that makes his vision blur at the edges. He drags himself to his usual spot outside Betty's diner, the bell above the door jingling every so often as customers come and go, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the silence that wraps around him like a shroud. He pulls his jacket tighter, the Purple Heart catching the dim light for just a moment, and he mutters his quiet plea again, voice rough as gravel. "Spare a bite? Anything helps." Most folks don't even slow down, their boots clicking past him like he's invisible, just another piece of the town's decay. But he keeps asking, because giving up isn't in his blood, even if every ounce of him feels like it's been ground down to dust. Inside the diner, Betty Harlan, a stout woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense air and a heart of gold, wipes down the counter with a rag that's seen better days. She's been running this place for over 20 years, a sanctuary of greasy spoon comfort, where the coffee's always hot and the pie's always homemade. Her greying hair is pulled back in a tight bun, and her apron is stained with ketchup and coffee spills, badges of a long morning shift. She's the kind of woman who knows every regular by name, who remembers how you take your eggs and whether you've got a sweet tooth for her famous pecan pie. But today, her sharp green eyes keep drifting to the window, to the figure hunched outside on the sidewalk. She's seen John there for months now, maybe years, always keeping his distance, always looking like he's carrying the weight of the world. She's slipped him a plate of leftovers a few times, a quiet act of kindness when no one else is looking, but there's always been a wall between them, an unspoken boundary neither has crossed. Until this morning. John's hands shake worse than usual as he lifts the tin cup, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. "Ma'am, just a crust of bread. I ain't had nothing in days." Betty hears him through the glass, and something in her chest tightens. Maybe it's the desperation in his tone. Maybe it's the way his shoulders slump like he's already given up on getting an answer. She pushes open the door, the bell jangling sharply, and steps out into the cold, a plate of day-old biscuits in her hands. "Hey, hun, got something for you," she says, her voice softer than usual, the kind of tone you'd use with a wounded animal. John looks up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes, and he reaches out with a mumbled, "Thank you, Mom," his fingers brushing the edge of the plate. As he pulls back, the sleeve of his jacket rides up just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo on his forearm, a set of numbers, a date, and two initials inked in faded black, surrounded by the faint outline of a military emblem. Betty freezes. Her breath catches in her throat, the plate nearly slipping from her hands. She knows that tattoo. She's seen it before, not in a dream or a photo, but branded into her memory from a time when the world was whole, when laughter filled her home instead of silence. Her eyes dart from the ink to John's face, searching, disbelieving, as if the puzzle pieces of a long-lost life are snapping into place. "John," she whispers, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear, a name she hasn't spoken in over a decade. Is that really you?" John's hand jerks back, the biscuit falling to the ground, his eyes widening with a terror he hasn't felt since the battlefield. He doesn't know how she knows his name, doesn't understand the look on her face, but something in her voice rips through the fog in his mind, stirring a memory he's fought to keep buried. Who is this woman? Why does her gaze feel like it's peeling back every layer of armor he's built around his shattered soul? And why, in the split second before he can bolt, does he feel the ghost of a life he thought he'd lost forever, reaching out to pull him back? John's breath hitched in his chest, the cold air burning his lungs as Betty's whisper, is that really you?" hung between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. His hand froze mid-air, the fallen biscuit forgotten on the icy pavement, his faded blue eyes wide with a raw, unfiltered panic. He stared at her, at the shock and recognition in her green gaze, and felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the world he'd tried so hard to disappear into was ripping itself open to drag him back to a past he couldn't face. His heart thundered, each beat a hammer against his ribs, and for a moment he was back in the desert, the roar of an explosion in his ears, the weight of failure crushing him. How did she know his name? Why did her voice sound like a ghost from a life he'd buried under years of silence and shame? He yanked his sleeve down over the tattoo, the ink that marked a date and initials he hadn't let himself look at in years, his fingers trembling more from fear than the cold. I don't know you, ma'am," he stammered, his voice rough and uneven, a lie that tasted bitter on his tongue. He pushed himself up from the cardboard, his bad knee buckling under him, every instinct screaming to run, to vanish into the grey streets of this nowhere town before whatever this was could tear him apart. But his body betrayed him, weak from hunger, heavy with exhaustion, and he stumbled, catching himself against the diner's brick wall. Inside, he was a storm of confusion and dread. Why did her eyes feel like they could see straight through to the man he'd been before the war broke him? Why did her face, lined with time but still somehow familiar, stir a pain in his chest he'd numbed with cheap whiskey and sleepless nights? Betty stepped closer, undeterred by his retreat, her own hands shaking as she clutched the empty plate like a lifeline. "John Carver, don't you dare tell me you don't know me," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of something unspoken, something that had been locked away for too long. "I've spent years wondering if you were even alive, looking at every stranger on the street, hoping, praying." She stopped, her breath catching, tears welling in her eyes as she studied him, taking in the scars, the hollows under his cheekbones, the man he'd become. "You can't hide from me. Not after everything." John's jaw clenched, his mind racing to build walls against whatever this was, to shut out the flood of memories her words threatened to unleash. He didn't want to remember. He couldn't afford to. Every piece of his past was shrapnel embedded too deep to pull out without bleeding out. "You've got the wrong guy," he muttered, turning away, his gaze fixed on the cracked sidewalk, on the escape route he couldn't quite take. But her words clung to him like the cold, seeping into the cracks of his armor, stirring ghosts he'd thought were long dead. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. Was she someone he'd hurt, someone he'd failed, like so many others? Or was she just another piece of a life he'd let slip through his fingers when he came home broken and useless? Betty didn't back down. She set the plate on the ground and crossed her arms, her voice steadying even as her eyes shimmered with pain. "I know that tattoo, John. October 12th, 2003. And those initials, EH. You think I could forget that day? You think I could forget what it meant to me? To us?" Her words hit him like a punch, each one a memory he'd fought to erase. October 12th, 2003. The day he'd made a promise, the day he'd felt whole for the last time before the war tore everything apart. And EH. Ellie Harlan, a name he hadn't let himself say in over a decade, tied to a grief so heavy it had driven him to the streets, to the shadows where he could hide from the weight of what he'd lost. His throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow, and he pressed a hand to the wall, steadying himself as the world spun. "Stop," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried all the desperation of a man drowning. "Just stop. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what I've done." The confession slipped out before he could stop it, raw and jagged, laced with a shame that had defined him since the day he'd come home without the person who mattered most. He didn't look at her. Couldn't, because if he did, he knew he'd see judgment, or worse, forgiveness he didn't deserve. Betty's expression softened, but the pain in her eyes only deepened. "I know more than you think," she said quietly, her voice a fragile thread stretched taut. "I know you carried more than anyone should have to. I know you came back different, and I know you thought running would make it hurt less. But you can't run from family, John. Not forever." The word, family, struck him harder than any bullet ever could. It dragged up images he'd buried, a small house on the edge of town, laughter over a kitchen table, the warmth of someone who'd once believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. And then the emptiness after, the silence that had swallowed everything when he couldn't save her, when he couldn't save anyone. He shook his head, a desperate jerky motion, his hands curling into fists. "I ain't got no family," he growled, the words a shield, but they cracked under the strain of his own doubt. "Not anymore. You got the wrong man, lady. Leave it be." He pushed off the wall, forcing his legs to move, each step a battle as he tried to put distance between them. The hunger still gnawed at him, the cold bit at his skin, but those were nothing compared to the ache her words had unearthed, the fear that if he stayed, he'd have to face the man he'd been, and the man he'd failed to be. Betty watched him stumble away, her own heart fracturing with every step he took, but she wasn't done. Not yet. She called after him, her voice firm despite the tremble in it. "You can walk away, John, but I'm not letting you disappear again. Not this time. You owe me that much." Her words stopped him cold, his shoulders hunching as if they'd struck him physically. Owe her. The weight of that debt was more than he could bear, a reminder of promises broken, of lives he'd shattered by simply existing when others didn't. He didn't turn back, but he didn't move forward either, trapped in the limbo of her challenge, his mind a battlefield of fear and longing. The tension clung to the air like frost as the day dragged on, the small town around them oblivious to the war, unfolding on the sidewalk outside Betty's diner. John kept his distance, lingering near the old war memorial a few blocks away, a slab of granite etched with names that haunted him. It was a place he often went to feel the weight of his survival, to trace the letters of men who died while he'd lived, a ritual of punishment he couldn't escape. The memorial sat in the heart of the town square, surrounded by bare trees and benches where folks sipped coffee on warmer days, a quintessentially American spot that held the ghosts of sacrifice, a fitting backdrop for the turmoil tearing at him now. He sat on the cold ground, his back against the stone, the Purple Heart pinned to his jacket catching the weak November light, a bitter irony. His fingers brushed the tattoo under his sleeve, the date and initials burning against his skin, and for the first time in years, he let himself remember Ellie's smile, the way she'd pressed her hand over his ink and promised they'd face whatever came together the day before he shipped out. And then the call that crushed him, the news of her accident while he was halfway across the world, powerless to do anything but scream into the dust of Iraq. The memory clawed at him, drawing blood, and he pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to block it out, but it was relentless. He'd come home to nothing, no Ellie, no home, no purpose, just a void he couldn't fill. And Betty, if she really was who he feared she was, Ellie's sister, then she was the last person who should want him back in her life. He'd failed Ellie, hadn't been there when she needed him most, and the guilt had driven him to the streets, to a life of invisibility where he couldn't hurt anyone else. But now, Betty's words echoed in his skull, a challenge he couldn't ignore. "You can't run from family." And what right did she have to drag him back into a world he'd poisoned? And yet, what right did he have to keep running when she'd clearly been carrying her own pain all these years? Hours passed, the sky darkening with the threat of snow, and John's resolve wavered. He couldn't go back to the diner, couldn't face her again, but the hunger and cold pushed him toward survival despite himself. He shuffled through alleys, scavenging for scraps, his mind replaying her voice, her accusations, until he found himself near the diner again, drawn back like a moth to flame. That's when he saw it, a small paper bag tucked under his usual piece of cardboard, weighed down by a rock to keep the wind from taking it. His hands shook as he opened it, finding a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, still warm, and a crumpled note in a handwriting he didn't recognize at first. "I'm not giving up on you. Come inside when you're ready." B. The gesture gutted him, a kindness he didn't deserve, and he clutched the note like it was a lifeline, though every part of him wanted to throw it away. Inside the diner, Betty stood behind the counter, her eyes red from quiet tears she'd shed in the back kitchen where no one could see. She hadn't told anyone about John, not yet, but the weight of seeing him, so broken, so lost, had reopened wounds she'd thought were scarred over. She kept glancing at the door, hoping, dreading, and when a regular asked if she was okay, she forced a smile and said, "Just tired, hun," though her voice betrayed her. In her apron pocket, she carried something she hadn't looked at in years, a faded photograph of Ellie and John, taken the day he got that tattoo, their smiles bright and unbroken. She'd kept it hidden, a relic of a time before grief stole everything, and now it felt like a ticking bomb, waiting for the moment she could show it to him, to prove she wasn't a stranger, to force him to remember. The weight of their shared past pressed down on both of them, two broken pieces of the same shattered life, orbiting closer despite the walls they'd built. For John, every step toward the diner felt like walking into enemy fire, his heart a war zone of guilt and fear. For Betty, every moment waiting was an exercise in patience and pain, knowing she couldn't force him to heal, but refusing to let him slip away again. And then there was a third presence, unspoken but heavy, Ellie, the ghost between them, the memory that tied their pain together and threatened to either mend or destroy what was left. As night fell, the diner's neon sign flickered above, a beacon in the growing dark, and John stood at the edge of the sidewalk, the paper bag still in his hand, the note crushed in his fist. His chest ached with a longing he couldn't name, a need to be seen, to be forgiven, warring with the certainty that he didn't deserve it. He thought of the war memorial, of the names etched in stone, of how easy it would be to keep running, to let himself fade into the cold forever. But Betty's words, her belief that he owed her, that he couldn't disappear again, clawed at him, a tether he couldn't snap. And somewhere deep beneath the layers of shame, a flicker of something else stirred. Hope, fragile and dangerous, whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was a way back. Hey, if you're feeling this story hit deep, do us a favor and subscribe for more moments like this. His inner voice seemed to urge, a quiet nudge amidst the storm, knowing others out there might need to see how this unfolds, how broken pieces can fight to fit again. He shook it off, focusing on the door ahead, the warm light spilling out, a stark contrast to the darkness he'd lived in for so long. The decision loomed, heavy as the first snowflake that drifted down, landing on his frayed jacket. He could walk away, vanish into the night, let the streets swallow him whole as they had for years. Or he could step inside, face Betty, face the past, and risk the kind of pain that might finally break him or save him. His hand hovered over the door handle, the cold metal biting into his skin, a mirror to the chill in his soul. Then, with a breath that felt like surrender, he pushed it open, the bell jangling like a gunshot, announcing his return to a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Betty looked up, her eyes meeting his across the diner, and in that moment, there was no hiding, no running, just the raw, unspoken truth that whatever came next, it would change them both forever. John stepped through the door of Betty's diner, the bell's sharp jangle slicing through the quiet hum of the late evening crowd. The warmth hit him first, a wall of comfort laced with the scent of coffee and fried onions, wrapping around him like an embrace he didn't know how to accept. His boots, worn thin at the soles, scuffed against the checkered linoleum, and every pair of eyes in the diner seemed to turn toward him, though he knew it was just his mind playing tricks. He felt exposed, raw, like a nerve stripped bare after years of hiding in the cold shadows of the streets. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might crack his ribs, each step forward a battle against the instinct to turn and run. Betty stood behind the counter, her hands frozen mid-wipe on a glass, her green eyes locking onto his with an intensity that pinned him in place. There was no escaping now, no retreating back to the oblivion of the sidewalk. The weight of her gaze, heavy with years of unspoken grief and stubborn hope, pressed down on him, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He stopped a few feet from the counter, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his frayed army jacket, fingers brushing against the crumpled note Betty had left in the paper bag. The words, "I'm not giving up on you," burned in his mind, a challenge he wasn't ready to face but couldn't ignore. The diner's chatter faded into a distant buzz, the world narrowing to just the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a chasm carved by time and loss. John's throat felt like sandpaper, his voice barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "I don't know what you want from me, Mom. I ain't got nothing left to give." His words hung heavy, laced with a desperation he couldn't mask, a plea for her to let him go before whatever this was shattered him completely. Betty's expression didn't waver, though her eyes shimmered with something he couldn't name, pain maybe, or a resolve stronger than steel. She set the glass down with deliberate care, as if any sudden move might spook him back out the door. "I don't want anything from you, John," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "I just want you to stop running long enough to see that you're not alone, that you've never been alone, even if you thought you were." Her words struck him like a physical blow, each one peeling back the layers of guilt and shame he'd wrapped around himself for over a decade. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that he'd been alone since the day he'd lost everything, since the day Ellie's light went out and left him in darkness. But the truth in her eyes, the way they seemed to see straight into the broken core of him, made the lies stick in his throat. He shifted, his bad knee throbbing under the strain of standing still, and glanced around the diner, half expecting judgment from the handful of late-night patrons nursing their coffee. But no one seemed to notice, or if they did, they hid it behind forks and mumbled conversations. His gaze drifted back to Betty, and he saw her reach into her apron pocket, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a small, faded photograph. She held it out to him, not forcing it into his hands, just offering it like a fragile peace flag. "Look at this, John," she said softly, her voice breaking on his name. "Tell me you don't remember." Bye. His stomach twisted, a sick dread pooling in his gut, but he couldn't stop himself from stepping closer, his hand shaking as he took the photo. The edges were worn, the colors dulled by time, but the image was a punch to the soul. There he was, younger, unbroken, standing with his arm around Ellie, her smile brighter than the sun on that October day in 2003. His tattoo was fresh on his forearm, the ink stark against his skin, a permanent mark of a promise he'd made to always come back to her. And in the background, blurry but unmistakable, was Betty, laughing as she held up a mock toast with a soda can. The memory crashed over him, vivid and merciless. The smell of barbecue in the air, the sound of Ellie's laughter, the feel of her hand in his, as they celebrated the life they'd planned together before he shipped out. A life that ended while he was thousands of miles away, powerless to stop the car accident that stole her from him. His breath hitched, a ragged sound that tore from his chest as he gripped the photo too hard, crumpling the corner. "Why are you doing this?" he rasped, his voice cracking under the weight of grief he'd carried alone for so long. "Why bring this up now?" "I failed her, Betty. I wasn't there when she needed me. I came back to nothing, and I've been nothing ever since. You think showing me this changes that?" His words spilled out, jagged and raw, each one a confession of the shame that had defined him, the belief that his survival was a mistake when so many, including Ellie, hadn't made it. Betty's face crumpled, tears spilling over, as she leaned across the counter, her voice a fierce whisper. "You didn't fail her, John. You fought for her, for all of us, over there. And when you came back broken, I failed you. I let you slip away because I didn't know how to reach you, how to carry my own grief and yours too. I should have looked harder, fought harder to find you. Ellie would have wanted me to. She loved you, and she'd hate seeing you punish yourself like this." Her words trembled with a pain as deep as his own, and for the first time, John saw it. The weight she'd carried, the guilt that mirrored his, the years she'd spent wondering if he was even alive while he wandered the streets, invisible and numb. The air between them thickened, heavy with shared loss, and John felt the walls he'd built start to fracture. He wanted to push back, to tell her she was wrong, that he didn't deserve her forgiveness or her fight, but the photo in his hand anchored him. A tether to a past he couldn't outrun. His eyes burned, a sting he hadn't felt in years, and he blinked hard, trying to hold it together, but the dam was breaking and he couldn't stop it. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted, his voice barely audible, a surrender to the truth he'd buried. "I don't know how to live with it. Every day I see her face, hear her voice, and I know I should have been there. I should have traded places with her." Betty shook her head, reaching out to grip his arm, her touch firm but gentle, grounding him when he felt like he might dissolve. "You don't get to choose who lives and who dies, John. But you do get to choose what you do with the time you've got left. Ellie wouldn't want you out there freezing and alone. She'd want you to fight, to keep going, even if it's just one step at a time. And I'm here to help you take that step, if you'll let me." Her voice cracked, raw, with a hope that terrified him, a lifeline he wasn't sure he could grab without pulling them both under. The weight of her words settled into him, heavy and warm, and for the first time in years, John felt the flicker of something other than guilt. A fragile, trembling thing that might have been hope, or at least the ghost of it. He looked down at the photo again, at Ellie's smile, and felt a sob claw its way up his throat, but he choked it down, his jaw tight. He didn't know if he could be the man Betty saw, the man Ellie had loved, but the exhaustion of running, of hiding, bore down on him until he couldn't fight it anymore. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, meeting Betty's gaze, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. "But I'm tired, Betty. I'm so damn tired of being nothing." Her hand tightened on his arm, a silent promise, and she nodded, tears streaming freely down her cheeks now. "You're not nothing, John. You never were. Let's start there." The simplicity of her words, the belief behind them, broke something open in him, a raw, aching release that left him trembling. He didn't have answers, didn't have a plan, but for the first time in over a decade, he didn't feel completely alone. The tension that had coiled tight in his chest began to unravel, not gone, but loosen just enough to let him breathe. In the days that followed, John's world shifted, slow and unsteady, like a rusted gear grinding back to life. Betty didn't push too hard, didn't demand he become someone new overnight, but she didn't let him slip away either. She gave him a cot in the diner's back room, a temporary fix she refused to call charity, framing it as helping out with odd jobs, even when he could barely lift a broom without his hands shaking. He swept floors after closing, washed dishes with fingers still clumsy from years of cold, and each small task felt like a mountain climbed, a quiet victory over the void he'd lived in. Betty was there every step. Her sharp tongue softened by the way she'd slide a plate of leftovers in front of him without a word, or the way she'd sit with him late at night over coffee, sharing stories of Ellie. Not the painful ones, but the silly ones, the memories that made them both laugh through the ache. The transformation wasn't easy. Nightmares still woke him, sweat-soaked and gasping, the ghosts of war and loss clawing at him in the dark. But Betty's steady presence, the warmth of the diner's walls, began to chip away at the numbness. He started shaving again, the mirror reflecting a face he didn't quite recognize, thinner and older, but with eyes less hollow. Locals began to nod at him, some offering quiet, "Thank you for your service" murmurs when they spotted the purple heart he still wore pinned to his cleaned-up jacket. The kindness felt foreign, sometimes unbearable, but he didn't run from it. Not anymore. He was learning to stand still, to let himself be seen, even if it hurt. One evening, as the first real snowfall blanketed the town in silence, John made a choice that carried the weight of a final surrender. He sat at the counter, Betty beside him, and unpinned the Purple Heart from his jacket with hands that still trembled but held steadier than they had in years. He slid it across to her, his voice low and rough. "I don't deserve to carry this no more. It ain't mine to hold on to when I've been hiding from what it cost. Keep it here, for Ellie, for what I couldn't be when she needed me." The act felt like shedding a skin he'd worn too long, a renunciation of the shame he'd let define him, a sacrifice of the last piece of armor he'd clung to. Betty took the medal, her fingers brushing against the tarnished metal, and nodded, her eyes glistening, but her mouth set in quiet understanding. She placed it on a shelf behind the counter, beside a framed photo of Ellie, a silent tribute to what they'd both lost and what they were trying to rebuild. Weeks later, on a bitter morning just before Christmas, John stood outside the diner as the first light of dawn crept over the snow-dusted streets. Betty had insisted he join her at the local cemetery, a place he hadn't visited since the day they'd buried Ellie, a place he'd avoided out of fear it would swallow him whole. But he'd gone, carrying a small wreath they'd made together from diner scraps, pine branches, and a red ribbon tied with clumsy knots. They'd placed it on Ellie's grave, the snow crunching under their boots, the air sharp with winter's bite. John hadn't spoken, hadn't needed to, but as he'd touched the headstone, tracing her name with a gloved finger, he'd felt a quiet settle over him. Not peace exactly, but a stillness that didn't cut so deep. Betty had stood beside him, her arm linked through his, an anchor against the cold, and for the first time he'd let himself grieve without running. Back at the diner, as the neon sign flickered to life above them, casting a warm red glow over the frosted windows, John watched the town stir awake. A young boy, bundled in a scarf, ran past with a dog at his heels, the pup's tail wagging as it bounded through a fresh drift of snow. The boy clutched a small toy soldier in his mittened hand, a cheap plastic thing, but he held it like a treasure, a symbol of heroes and dreams not yet tarnished by time. John's chest tightened, a bittersweet ache, as he thought of the men whose names were etched on the war memorial, of the sacrifices that lived on in small, quiet ways, even in a child's imagination. Time, he realized, was a merciless thing, stealing and giving in equal measure, marking every soul with its scars. But it also carried the promise of healing, of rebeginnings, if you could bear to hold on through the storm. War had taken much from him, and grief more. But in the silence of that morning, standing shoulder to shoulder with Betty, he understood that the fight wasn't over, that maybe, just maybe, the hardest battles were the ones fought to rebuild, to remember, to live again. He turned to Betty, his voice rough but steady, and said, "Thank you for not giving up." She smiled, a small, weary thing, but it held a strength that mirrored his own fragile resolve. "We've got a long road, John, but we'll walk it together," she replied. And in her words, he heard the echo of family, of a bond not broken by years or pain, but forged anew in the quiet of shared healing. If this story touched something deep in you, if it reminded you of the power of second chances or the weight of unseen battles, please take a moment to comment below. I believe in healing. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone, someone who might find hope in John and Betty's fight to start again. And if you want to see more stories that crack open the heart and stitch it back together, hit that subscribe button. We're here to remind you that even in the coldest winters, there's warmth waiting on the other side.